Noam, welcome to Democracy Now! First, let's get your response to President Obama announcing last night in a nationwide address, which I'm sure was watched worldwide, that for the moment there would be no strike on Syria as the U.S. supports the Russian plan to deal with the chemical weapons stockpile of Syria.
Well, the Russian plan is a godsend for Obama. It saves him from what would look like a very serious political defeat. He can maintain the threat of force, which incidentally is a crime under international law. We should bear in mind that the core principle of the United Nations Charter bars the threat or use of force. Threat or use of force. So all of this is criminal to begin with, but he'll continue with that. The United States is a rogue state. It doesn't pay any attention to international law. The idea that the U.S. has introduced and imposed principles of international law, that's hardly even a joke. The United States has even gone so far as to veto Security Council resolutions calling on all states to observe international law. That was in the 1980s under Reagan. No state was mentioned, but it was evident that the intention was to request the United States to observe international law after it had rejected a World Court judgment condemning it for what was called unlawful use of force. It means international terrorism against Nicaragua. In fact,
and what interest does the U.S. have in striking Syria militarily?
The reason, the pretexts for imposing, for carrying out a forceful act have generally declined to the point that even the British government hasn't accepted them. Congress is apparently going to reject them. And the United States, the government resorted to what is usually the last resort when everything else fails, saying our credibility is at stake. And that's correct. U.S. credibility is at stake. Obama issued an edict, and it has to be enforced. That's a familiar doctrine. It's one of the leading doctrines of world affairs. Credibility of powerful, violent states must be maintained. It's occasionally called the mafia doctrine. It's essentially the doctrine by which the Godfather rules his domains within the mafia system. That's one of the leading principles of world order. In the mafia system, if some small storekeeper decides not to pay protection money, the money may not mean anything to the Godfather, but he's not going to let him get away with it. And in fact, he's not just going to go in and send his goons to get the money. He's also going to beat him to a pulp, because others have to understand that disobedience is not tolerated. In international affairs, that's called credibility.
And what do you think the U.S. or the international community should do to deal with this alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria? What do you think the appropriate response would be?
The appropriate response would be to call for imposing the Chemical Weapons Convention in the Middle East, in fact beyond, but we'll keep to the Middle East, which would mean that any country that is in violation of that convention, whether it has accepted it or not, would be compelled to eliminate its chemical weapons stores. Just maintaining those stores, producing chemical weapons, all of that's in violation of the convention. And now's a perfect opportunity to do that. Of course, that would require that U.S. ally Israel give up its chemical weapons and permit international inspections.
How do you see the situation in Syria being resolved?
Well, Syria right now is plunging into suicide. If the negotiations options that Dr. Brahimi and Russia and others have been pressing, if that doesn't work, Syria is moving towards a kind of very bloody partition. There is another part of Syria which is not talked about. It's occupied by Israel and annexed by Israel. It's the Golan Heights, annexed in violation of explicit Security Council orders not to annex it. Their credibility doesn't matter because Israel's an ally. So that's another part of Syria. That brings us to Israel-Palestine. Just a couple of days ago, Secretary of State Kerry, appealed to the European Union to continue to support illegal, criminal Israeli settlement projects in the West Bank. Wasn't put in those words. But the way it is put is that Europe had taken the quite appropriate step of trying to draw back from support for Israeli operations in the illegal settlements. Incidentally, that the settlements are illegal is not even in question. That's been determined by the highest authorities, the Security Council of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice. In fact, up until the Reagan administration, the U.S. also called them illegal. Reagan changed that to an obstacle to peace, and Obama has weakened it still further to not helpful to peace. But the U.S. is virtually alone in this. The rest of the world accepts the judgment of the Security Council of the International Court of Justice that the settlements are illegal, not just the expansion of the settlements, but the settlements themselves. And